Hi everyone, this week I have another compilation of 5 interesting cases involving Hollywood. Once again, it's a long video, so please enjoy. Also, please remember to click like, subscribe and comment. Thanks very much.
For today's true crime narration, we shall be returning to November 2010 and visiting Los Angeles, California. It was around 12:25 a.m. on Tuesday the 16th of November when residents in the upscale area of Beverly Hills were disturbed by the sound of 4 gunshots followed by the crash of a car. Multiple calls to the police followed, and when officers arrived at the scene, they found a 2010 black Mercedes-Benz E350 which had mounted the curb before crashing into and knocking down a street lamp. Behind the wheel of the car was a woman, smartly dressed in a dark blue dress and trousers. She was slumped over the inflated airbag, bleeding heavily, barely clinging to life. Medics worked to assist the woman, who was promptly transferred to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, where, despite the doctor's best efforts, she was pronounced dead at 1:12 a.m. This began a murder inquiry which, whilst promptly officially solved, has left many with questions as to whether it has actually ever been fully resolved. The woman in the Mercedes was 64-year-old Ronni Chasen, better known as Ronni. She was a well-known and well-respected publicist working in the film industry. Ronni was born on the 17th of October 1946 in Kingston, New York, the second child of Carolyn and Irving Cohen. She grew up in Riverdale, the Bronx, and Washington Heights, Manhattan, with her older brother Larry, who would later become a famous screenwriter, producer, and director. Ronni moved to Los Angeles in the 1970s, initially to pursue a career in acting, but instead began working as a publicist. She headed the publicity department for American International Pictures before serving 10 years as the executive vice president of motion pictures at the prestigious public relations agency, Rogers & Cowan. Ronni was appointed the senior vice president of publicity for MGM in 1993, and after that went on to set up her own company, Chasen & Co. Whilst relatively unknown to those outside of the industry, within Hollywood circles she was noted and respected for her publicity work for some of Hollywood's biggest stars and movie productions. She was a spokeswoman for top filmmakers, a key strategist for producers who were chasing an Oscar win, and was responsible for the publicity work of some of Hollywood's biggest stars, including Morgan Freeman, Michael Douglas, and John Travolta, as well as composers of film music such as Hans Zimmer. Ronni worked extremely hard on behalf of her clients and expected those around her to do the same. She was tenacious and professional, developing long-lasting relationships with those she worked with. Ronni was married briefly when she was in her 20s and chose not to have children, considering her friends and clients as her family. She worked on publicity and Oscar campaigns for more than 100 movies, including The Hurt Locker, Cocoon, On Golden Pond, Dreamgirls, and Driving Miss Daisy. At the time of her death in 2010, she was working on the Oscar campaign for Alice in Wonderland, starring Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter. Over the years, her clients had netted over 150 Oscar nominations, with her music clients earning more than 65 Grammy nominations. On the evening of Monday the 15th of November 2010, Ronni attended the premiere of Burlesque at Grauman's Chinese Theatre in Hollywood. Following the premiere, she attended the after-party at the W Hollywood Hotel on Hollywood Boulevard. Ronni left the party at around midnight to drive home to her condominium on Wilshire Boulevard. At 12:22 a.m, Ronni made a call from her mobile phone to the phone at her office in order to dictate a to-do list for the following day. This was not uncommon for Ronni, who worked at all hours of the night and day. Approximately 6 minutes after making this call, she stopped at a red traffic light in the left turn lane at the junction of Sunset Boulevard and Whittier Drive in Beverly Hills. Whilst at this junction, Ronni was shot 4 times through the front passenger side window of her Mercedes. The car drifted a short distance along Whittier Drive. less than a quarter of a mile, before mounting the curb and knocking down a street lamp in front of number 815. Residents reported hearing gunshots, and the noise of the crash and an investigation by the Beverly Hills Police Department was soon underway. As news of Ronni's murder was reported, there was shock among those who knew her and the local community, murders being extremely rare in this upmarket area of Los Angeles. The investigation initially concentrated on gathering forensic evidence from the scene and piecing together the order of events from the various 911 calls. There was no obvious motive or immediate suspects. The residents of the Whittier Drive neighbourhood were canvassed for CCTV footage, and both the W Hotel and Ronni's condominium were searched for clues. On the 20th of November, it was reported in the press that the mayor of Beverly Hills, Jimmy Delshad, had said that the shots were fired from a higher position, indicating that the killer may have been in an SUV or truck. It was later clarified that this was the mayor's theory as opposed to the official position of the police department. That evening, details of Ronni's murder were featured on the TV show America's Most Wanted. Her funeral was held the following day, on Sunday the 21st of November. The 250-seat chapel was full, with a further 300 guests seated under a canopy to watch the service on a screen, and an overflow of guests who had to stand for the ceremony. Harold Matzner, on behalf of the Palm Springs Film Festival, announced that they were offering a $100,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Ronni's murderer. Another friend of Ronni's, Michael Levine, also offered a $25,000 reward. A week after the murder, the press reported that there were several clues which pointed to this being a professional killing. It was also reported that a friend of Ronni claimed that Ronni had spoken about being followed in March of that year and that she was afraid. Reportedly, the shots were fired quickly and evenly, and newspapers began speculating about a hitman-style murder with carefully targeted shots. No shell casings, live rounds or murder weapon had been found. With little to go on, speculation became rife as to who was responsible for the murder. Was this road rage, a drive-by shooting, a robbery? Was she followed home from the movie premiere? Was it a professional hit, or maybe a crime of passion? People were trying to make sense of this senseless act of violence. Rumours began to circulate about gambling debts, art deals, and unscrupulous film finance. However, those who knew Ronni denied this possibility. She was honest and straight-talking, wasn't a drinker, never did drugs, and had clients with whom she developed such good relationships she considered them family. Several days after America's Most Wanted aired, a tip was received from someone who believed that one of their neighbours may have been involved in the crime. This neighbour was 43-year-old Harold Martin Smith. Harold had various convictions dating back at least 25 years. He had completed 2 terms in state prison, having last been released in 2007 following a robbery conviction, and then discharged from parole in 2009. Harold had been living in the Harvey, a low-cost residential hotel on Santa Monica Boulevard in East Hollywood. He was unemployed, penniless, and rode a bicycle. At around 5:30 p.m. on December 1st, 2010, the Beverly Hills Police approached Harold in the lobby of the Harvey to serve a search warrant. As they did so, Harold raised a gun and shot himself in the right temple, dying instantly. Those who knew Harold said that after 2 terms in state prison, he always vowed that he would die before going back again. Regardless of whether or not he had been involved in Ronni's murder, an armed criminal being approached by the police would result in another prison term, something it would seem that Harold had no intention of doing. Some news reports stated that the witnesses had heard Harold boasting about killing Ronni, while others claimed that he had said he had killed her for $10,000. The police declared that Harold was a person of interest in Ronni's murder whilst awaiting further results. By the 6th of December, the press were reporting that the gun used in Harold's suicide was likely not the same weapon that had been used to kill Ronni. The Daily News ran a story that residents in the location of Ronni's murder had received an email detailing a man who had approached a woman at a stoplight, rolled down the window, smiled and pointed a gun at her before quickly driving off. The Daily News also stated that days after Ronnie's death, a 53-year-old man was shot through the passenger window of his car in Covina, California, in a similar attack. Thankfully, the man survived, although no official link was ever made between these cases. On the 8th of December, the Beverly Hills Police Department held a press conference stating that the gun Harold used to take his own life was a preliminary match to the one used to kill Ronnie. The police chief, David Snowden, stated that they had believed that Harold had killed Ronnie in an attempted robbery. They believed that Harold had acted alone, and they did not believe that this was a professional hit and that they were not looking for anyone else in connection with Ronnie's murder. It was later reported that 4 shell casings were found during the search of Harold's belongings, although I've been unable to find any additional information about this. After 3 weeks of frenzied speculation about hired killers, gang initiations, gambling debts and the like, it seemed that Ronnie had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, many were left unconvinced by this conclusion. Newspapers were reporting that people were still questioning this official version of events, believing that there were too many unanswered questions and things simply did not add up. If this was a robbery, why had so many valuables been left in the car? Harold could simply have reached in through the shot-out window and taken Ronnie's handbag and purse. Harold rode a bicycle and did not have access to a car. Was it a reasonable conclusion that this crime had been completed on a bicycle? There were no eyewitnesses or CCTV which put Harold at the scene, which led to many questioning how a poor black man carrying a gun could have gone unnoticed when cycling around affluent Beverly Hills. If it were true that Harold had been bragging about a $10,000 windfall, where was this money coming from if he was acting alone? With weeks of talk of military-trained assassins, particularly in relation to the even spacing of the gunshots, could this murder really have been completed by this small-time criminal on a bicycle who was desperate for money? Were shell casings found in Harold's possessions? The news reports had previously reported that the gun used in Harold's suicide wasn't a match to Ronnie's murder, and many latched onto this apparently incorrect piece of reporting. However, those with doubts did not have a better theory of what had actually happened. The earlier rumours of gambling debts and the art world all turned out to be false. The valuables left at the scene could easily be explained. Ronnie's car had drifted for around a quarter of a mile after the shooting, which may have meant that Harold lost his opportunity to grab anything. Using a bicycle in a crime is far more common than most people think due to being easy to transport, the ability to quickly travel in narrow areas like alleyways, and ease of disposal. Could it be that those who knew and loved Ronnie did not want to believe that she had been taken away from them in such a random and unfair way, and because of this were seeking a better explanation for her death? In 2011, a news release was issued stating that after an exhaustive investigation, including a review of financial documents, thousands of emails and texts, as well as following up on many of the leads, the investigation had been completed. It was the conclusion of the homicide detectives that the sole perpetrator was Harold Martin Smith. In October that year, it was reported that Harold Matzner and Michael Levine, who had offered the reward money, were being sued by the person who provided the tip to America's Most Wanted because they had not paid the reward. Harold Matzner defended his position, stating that many people were disturbed about the case and do not believe that there was enough evidence to come to the conclusion that the killer had been identified. Whilst there was a suspect who had taken his own life, there had not been an arrest nor conviction of the person responsible. Harold Matzner went on to state that if the money did not go to the tipster, it would go to a good charitable cause. It was not about the money, he wanted justice for Ronnie. The lawsuit was eventually settled for an undisclosed amount. Many of the police reports and documents in relation to the case remained private, despite requests for these to be available. In California, autopsies are public record except when there is an active case or investigation. However, Ronnie's still remained private. This reluctance to share documents in a resolved case where both the victim and perpetrator are dead caused alarm bells with some people. The independent documentary maker Ryan Katzenbach entered a legal battle with the Beverly Hills Police Department and LA County Coroner's Office in 2013. This eventually resulted in some, but not all, of the documents related to the case being made available. During an interview with The Hollywood Reporter in 2016, it is clear that Ryan believes that there is more to be discovered about this case. The question remains that if this case had gone to trial, would it have been possible to convict Harold beyond a reasonable doubt? Sadly, to some, Harold's suicide was seen as an admission of his guilt. Ronni's estate was worth around $6 million at the time of her death. After taxes, legal fees and charity donations were made, the remainder of her estate was left to her favourite niece, Larry Cohen's daughter, Melissa. Larry's other daughter, Jill Gatsby, was, in the words of the will, intentionally and with full knowledge of the consequences, bequeathed just $10. Jill stated that she loved her aunt, but there was a family secret regarding Ronni and Jill's career as a writer, which Jill was choosing to keep to herself. Gail Reed sent me an email back in April suggesting that I should cover this case. Thanks for the suggestion, Gail. As usual, please remember to add any comments down below. I'll look forward to reading them. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. For today's true crime narration, we shall be visiting Hollywood to look at the traumatic life of Cheryl Crane. Whilst being the child of a rich and famous movie star must come with extreme privilege, it is often the case that such luxury comes with a heavy price, and that was certainly the case for Cheryl Crane. Cheryl was born on the 25th of July 1943 to movie star Lana Turner and restaurateur husband Stephen Crane. Cheryl's start in life was far from easy when, due to incompatibility with her mother's Rh blood factor, her life swayed in the balance for nearly 2 months. Lana was most definitely not a hands-on mother, and Cheryl spent much of her early years with her nanny. Lana, meanwhile, lived a glamorous lifestyle far from her own humble beginnings. She was born Julia Jean Mildred Frances Turner on the 8th of February 1920 in Wallace, Idaho. She was the only child of John Virgil Turner and Mildred Frances Cowan, who was just 16 years old when Lana was born. The family struggled for money and relocated to San Francisco when Lana was 6 years old, and soon after her parents separated. On December 14th, 1930, Lana's father won some money at a travelling craps game. He hid his winnings in his left sock and headed for home. He was later found bludgeoned to death on the corner of Minnesota and Mariposa streets with his left shoe and sock missing. His murder was never solved, and his premature death had a profound effect on 10-year-old Lana. Lana's mother often worked 80 hours a week to try to make ends meet, and Lana would often spend time living with family friends whilst her mother tried to save money. It was during one of these stays that Lana was abused, and soon after, her mother decided to make the move to Los Angeles in search of a better life. It was here that Lana's dreams of becoming an actress were born, and she began searching for movie roles. At the age of 17, she had small parts in the movies They Won't Forget, The Great Garrick, and the 1937 version of A Star Is Born. The following year, she had a small part on the 1938 film Love Finds Andy Hardy, starring Mickey Rooney, and she became known as the Sweater Girl for her immense beauty and on-screen charisma. By the time Cheryl was born, she had progressed to being one of the highest paid actresses in the United States and one of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's biggest stars. Whilst her film career went from strength to strength, her private life would often overshadow her professional accomplishments. Over the course of her life, she was married 8 times, including twice to Cheryl's father, Stephen Crane. She battled with alcoholism and went through the ordeal of 3 stillbirths in 1949, 51 and 56, all as a result of complications due to her blood. Cheryl had a series of stepfathers during her life and, in her memoirs, would refer back to both of her parents as having driven personalities, vain, gifted, selfish and wild, adding that she was enthralled by them, but I lived at a distance, their princess in a tower. She said that she had a lonely childhood, and would often slip out of bed to watch her mother and her glamorous friends from a distance. Far more sinister was the abuse which Cheryl suffered at the hands of some of her mother's friends and lovers. In Cheryl's memoirs, she states that the movie star Fernando Lamas would swim naked in front of her when they were alone, and that a nanny touched her inappropriately and nibbled her ear. She goes on to state that Tarzan star Lex Barker, Lana's fourth husband, first sexually abused her in the family sauna when she was only 10 years old, and he then continued to violently abuse her throughout his marriage to her mother. When Cheryl eventually told her mother, Lana immediately went home and held a gun to Lex's head while he was sleeping. She woke him and kicked him out of the house. However, it was Lana's relationship with Johnny Stompanato which would cause the headlines that would stay with the family forever. In the spring of 1957, Lana was shooting the film The Lady Takes a Flyer in Los Angeles. During this time, she began receiving phone calls and flowers by a man using the name of John Steele. John Steele was actually 32-year-old Johnny Stompanato, a mobster with close ties to the Los Angeles underworld and gangster Mickey Cohen. He feared that if Lana knew the truth of who he was, she would not date him. He aggressively pursued her, showering her with gifts and attention, and the pair soon began dating. When Lana found out his true identity, she confronted him and ended their relationship. However, Johnny was not a man who gave up easily, and he wore Lana down. The relationship continued, but became ever more violent. It was marked by a cycle of violent arguments, physical abuse, and repeated reconciliation. It has been claimed that Johnny drugged Lana, and when she was unconscious, took nude photographs of her to use as blackmail. Whilst filming Another Time, Another Place with Sean Connery in London in September 1957, Johnny visited Lana in England. As had become somewhat of a pattern, the visit started well, but soon took a turn, with eventually Johnny violently choking Lana and holding a razor to her face and threatening to disfigure her. When Johnny turned up on set, he was confronted by Sean Connery, who protected his co-star Lana. The police were then involved, and Johnny left the country the following day. Yet again, the couple reconciled and spent January and February of the following year holidaying in Acapulco. However, things took another dramatic turn when Lana attended the Academy Awards on the 26th of March 1958, taking her daughter Cheryl and her mother Mildred as her guests. Johnny was furious that Lana had not taken him with her and waited at the house until she returned, whereupon he physically assaulted her. A few days later, Lana and Cheryl moved into a new rental home on North Bedford Drive in Beverly Hills. Then, on the 4th of April, Lana and 14-year-old Cheryl went on a shopping trip, during which Lana told Cheryl that she planned to end her relationship with Johnny that evening once and for all, stating that it's going to be a rough night. When Johnny arrived that evening, he and Lana got into a heated argument in the bedroom. Cheryl, who was watching television in the adjacent room, could hear everything, and when Johnny threatened to kill Lana, Cheryl and Mildred, Cheryl rushed to the kitchen, grabbed a knife and rushed to her mother's defence. As Lana attempted to get Johnny out of the bedroom, Cheryl was waiting at the door. She stabbed Johnny once in the stomach. Johnny looked at her and said, "My God, Cheryl, what have you done?" Cheryl ran out of the room, placed a knife on the table and rushed to phone her father. Meanwhile, Lana called for a doctor who attempted to revive Johnny, but without success. Johnny was pronounced dead at the scene. In the early hours of the 5th of April, Cheryl turned herself into the police and was held at Juvenile Hall. By this time, Lana and Stephen had retained celebrity attorney Jerry Giesler to represent Cheryl. Due to Lana's fame, the case was quickly involved in a media frenzy, with many speculating as to what had actually happened that night. It was confirmed that Johnny had died from a single stab wound that penetrated his liver, portal vein and aorta, resulting in massive internal hemorrhaging. An inquest was held on the 12th of April 1958. There were over 100 reporters and journalists present, with the atmosphere being described as being near riotous. Lana testified as to the events surrounding Johnny's death. She said that she had initially thought that Cheryl had punched Johnny, only realising that he had been stabbed when he collapsed to the floor covered in blood. Lana appeared to be on the brink of collapse throughout the time that she gave evidence. After a total of just 4 hours of testimony and 25 minutes of deliberation, the 12-member coroner's jury unanimously deemed that the killing was a justifiable homicide, absolving Cheryl and Lana of any wrongdoing. However, many questioned this decision. Outside the courtroom, a friend of Johnny's said, "It's a lie. The girl was in love with him. There was jealousy between her and her mother. He was a gentleman." Numerous publications questioned whether Lana's courtroom appearance was her best acting performance of her life, and conspiracy theories circulated that it was actually Lana who had stabbed Johnny to death. Johnny's family sought a wrongful death suit in the sum of $750,000 against Lana and Cheryl's father, Stephen Crane. In the suit, Johnny's son alleged that Lana had been responsible for the death and that Cheryl had taken the blame. The suit was settled in May 1962, reportedly for $20,000. Despite being cleared of any crime, Cheryl's ordeal was far from over. She had to remain a ward of the court until a juvenile court hearing was held 12 days later. At this point, the judge expressed concern over proper parental supervision, and at Cheryl's request, she was released into the care of her grandmother and ordered to regularly visit a psychiatrist along with her parents. Cheryl ran away from her grandmother's, was put in boarding school, and then ran away again. She began abusing alcohol and pills and attempted suicide on 2 separate occasions. However, at 21, she started working with her father at his restaurant in Hollywood, the Luau. Over the next 15 years, she would turn her life around, eventually becoming vice president of the successful hospitality company. She would later become a real estate agent, married her partner of 40 years, and it is believed she now lives in Palm Springs. In her 1988 autobiography, she discussed the killing for the first time, stating that she had killed Johnny and claiming that he had been sexually abusing her. Lana died on the 25th of June 1995 after a long battle with throat cancer. She was 74 years old. Still, conspiracy theories remained, exacerbated when Eric Root, a hairdresser of Lana's, claimed in a 1996 memoir that Lana had confessed to him that she had stabbed Johnny during their domestic struggle. She reportedly said to him, "I killed the son of a bitch and I would do it again." He added that Lana had urged him to reveal this to the public should she die before him in order to clear her daughter's name. However, Cheryl denied this claim, stating that his book is so far-fetched. You know, everybody has something they want to sell. I guess it was the only way he could get his book published. So what do you think? Did Cheryl lie or kill to protect her mother? I'd love to hear your theories in the comments section below. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. As well as Cheryl's autobiography, she has also written other books. This is what I found on a search on the Amazon website. Thanks and goodbye. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life of Bonnie Lee Bakley. Bonnie was born on the 7th of June 1956 in Morristown, New Jersey, to Edward and Marjorie Bakley. Her father, Edward, was an alcoholic, and both Bonnie and her younger sister, Marjorie, had a poor relationship with both of their parents. When Bonnie was 8 years old, her and Marjorie were sent to live with their grandmother. At the age of 15, Bonnie left school and moved to New York, determined to make her name as a model. She attended the Barbizon School of Modelling, and while she was living in New York, she met a man by the name of Evangelos Paulakis. Evangelos was an illegal immigrant who was desperate to remain in the US. In 1971, Bonnie agreed to marry Evangelos to enable him to remain in the country. In return, Evangelos paid Bonnie an unknown sum of money. Almost immediately after the marriage was legalised, Bonnie ended it and Evangelos was deported. A few years later, in November 1977, by which time Bonnie had returned to live in New Jersey, she married her second husband, Paul Garon. Paul was not only Bonnie's husband, but also her first cousin. The couple had 2 children together, a son named Glenn and a daughter who they called Holly. Their marriage lasted for 5 years before Bonnie and Paul divorced in 1982. Bonnie was ambitious, driven, and craved the lifestyle of a celebrity. She was desperate to become famous, but lacked any real talent. Despite not being a very good singer, she recorded a song under the name of Lee Bakley. She also attempted to forge a dance career. Both of these attempts at fame were unsuccessful. In order to support herself, she set up a mail order business selling nude photographs of women, including herself. Additionally, she ran advertisements in magazines where she would take on a number of different identities of women who were looking for male companions. Once she received replies to these advertisements, she would ask these men to give her money, travel expenses, or large gifts. These businesses became quite successful and lucrative, enabling her to buy several houses. However, this still was not enough to fulfill her desire for fame. As time moved on, her cons became more elaborate. She would lure often older men into relationships, take their money, and disappear. Bonnie was a professional con artist, using over 50 aliases to create fake personalities in order to extort or steal money from unsuspecting men. During this time, her 2 children were aware of her dubious and illegal business practices. Despite this, they loved their mother very much and maintained great relationships with her. It seems that, despite many illegal lifestyle choices, she was a good mother to these 2 young children. In the early 1980s, she married for a 3rd time to a man by the name of Roger Moon. The marriage lasted less than 3 years and was quickly followed up by a 4th marriage to DeMart C. Besley in 1988. That marriage was annulled almost immediately. Unsurprisingly, Bonnie had several run-ins with the law. She was arrested on multiple occasions for offences such as possession of fraudulent driver's licences, holding fake social security details, and trying to cash bad cheques. She received multiple fines and completed community service, but was not imprisoned for her crimes. With her dreams of becoming famous herself unsuccessful, Bonnie became increasingly obsessed with and determined to marry a celebrity. In the early 1990s, Bonnie decided to move to Memphis, Tennessee. She had set her sights on becoming the girlfriend of Jerry Lee Lewis, the world-famous American singer and pianist. After 2 more short-lived marriages in 1992 to Joseph Brookshire and to William Weber in 1993, both of which were subsequently annulled, she started to follow Jerry Lee Lewis around and managed to befriend his sister. In July 1993, Bonnie gave birth to her 3rd child, a daughter who she named Jerry Lee. Bonnie claimed that the child was the daughter of Jerry Lee Lewis, but a DNA test proved otherwise. It is unclear whether or not Bonnie and Jerry had ever had a physical relationship. His manager at the time claimed that this was not the case, but Bonnie's sister believes that they were romantically involved. After her daughter Jerry's birth, Bonnie left Jerry to be raised by her second husband Paul, who may possibly have been Jerry's biological father. Bonnie then moved to California, where she decided to pursue other celebrities, rumoured to include Dean Martin, Frankie Valli, and Gary Busey. Whether or not she ever met or became involved with these men is unclear. In 1994, she married Robert Tellefson, her 7th husband. Once again, the marriage was annulled soon after. In 1995, she married Glyn H. Wolfe, a Baptist minister from Blythe, California. Glyn was famous for holding the record for the largest number of monogamous marriages. Bonnie became his 29th wife and he her 8th husband. This marriage was once again annulled. The following year, in 1996, she married for the 9th time to John Ray. During the 1990s, she had developed an interest in Christian Brando, the son of the American actor Marlon Brando and the actress Anna Kashfi. At that time, Christian was serving a 10-year sentence, having pleaded guilty to the voluntary manslaughter of his sister's boyfriend, who he had shot in the face. Whilst Christian was in prison, Bonnie began writing to him and including nude photographs of herself in the letters. When Christian was released in 1996, Bonnie, who was newly married to John Ray at the time, and Christian became romantically involved. Their relationship continued throughout her marriage to John Ray, which ended in divorce in 1998. In 1999, Bonnie also became involved with the actor Robert Blake after meeting him at a jazz club. Robert, who was 66 at the time, had been an actor since he was a child and was best known for his role in the 1970s TV series Beretta, for which he won an Emmy in 1975. The following year, in June 2000, Bonnie gave birth to her 4th child, a daughter who she named Christian Shannon Brando. Shortly after the birth, Bonnie confided in Robert that she was unsure whether he or Christian was the baby's father. Robert immediately insisted upon a paternity test, and when it was revealed that the baby girl was his, her name was legally changed to Rose Lenore Sophia Blake. Christian Brando, obviously irate at Bonnie's deception and reportedly finding out that the baby wasn't his from the National Enquirer, broke off their relationship. Despite a lack of feelings between Bonnie and Robert, the pair were married in November 2000. Bonnie had finally achieved her dream of marrying a celebrity, but Robert had only married Bonnie as she was the mother of his child. The marriage was unconventional from the start. A prenuptial agreement stipulated that if either spouse ended the marriage, the other would retain custody of Rose. It also stated that Bonnie had to get Robert's permission before any of her family or friends could visit her and Rose. The couple never actually lived together, with Bonnie and Rose residing in a small guest house on Robert's property. It was reported to be an unhappy union, with very little compassion or care between the two. 5 months after their marriage, on 4th of May 2001, Bonnie and Robert went out to dinner at Robert's favourite restaurant, Vitello's in Studio City. Robert was such a regular at the restaurant, there was even a dish named after him on the menu. The couple dined together, seemingly quite relaxed in each other's company, and just before 9:30 p.m. walked out to Robert's car, a 1991 black Dodge Stealth, which was parked around the corner from the restaurant. As they approached the car, Robert realised that he had left something at the restaurant. Bonnie decided to wait in the car while Robert went back to Vitello's. When Robert returned to the car, 44-year-old Bonnie had been shot in the head. Panicking, Robert ran to a nearby house and started banging on the door. The owner, Sean Stanek, answered and found Robert yelling that they needed to call 911. The emergency services arrived shortly afterwards, but Bonnie could not be saved. Robert was in a state of shock. Soon after, it was discovered that the item which he had returned to the restaurant to collect was his gun. An extensive murder investigation followed, with Robert being a suspect from day one. However, with the various scams that Bonnie had been involved in throughout her life, and Christian Brando being furious over the DNA results, the list of suspects was extensive. It was soon established that the gun Robert had been carrying on the night of the murder was not the one used to kill Bonnie. The murder weapon was discovered in a nearby bin. Robert was tested for gunshot residue, and it was also determined that he had not pulled the trigger. When questioned by the police, Robert explained that he had started to carry a gun as Bonnie had become concerned for her own safety. A truck had been seen outside of their house at all hours of the night and day, and when approached was quickly driven away. After over a year of extensive investigation, a press conference was called on the 18th of April 2002. It was announced that Robert was responsible for Bonnie's death and that he was about to be arrested. His arrest, along with that of one of his bodyguards, was televised. Robert was charged with 2 counts of soliciting murder and murder with special circumstances. He was refused bail and put in isolation due to the high-profile nature of his case. Robert was keen to set up a television interview from within the jail, causing 2 of his lawyers, who were completely against the idea, to quit. After he had been in jail awaiting his trial for almost a year, on 26th of February 2003, Robert completed a television interview with ABC's host, Barbara Walters. During this interview, he strenuously denied any involvement whatsoever in Bonnie's death. Meanwhile, Bonnie's sister Marjorie, along with Bonnie's 4 children, the youngest, Rose, being less than 2 years old at the time, filed a wrongful death suit against Robert. This put his defence lawyers in a very difficult position, as for a civil case, Robert could be deposed and called as a witness. Whereas in the criminal case, whether or not Robert would testify would be their decision. The civil case was ultimately delayed, and the preliminary hearing for the criminal case took place in early 2003. It was determined that Robert would stand trial for the murder, and unusually, he was allowed out on $1.5 million bail while awaiting the trial. After falling out with his attorney, Thomas Mesereau, who went on to defend Michael Jackson, Robert hired a little-known lawyer by the name of Gerald Schwartzbach. Gerald completely believed in his client's innocence and was confident of an acquittal when the trial finally got underway in December 2004. If convicted, Robert would face life without the possibility of parole. The prosecution case centred around 2 retired stuntmen, Gary McLarty and Ronald Duffy Hambleton. They both testified that they had been approached by Robert to kill Bonnie. The prosecution showed that Duffy had bought a prepaid phone, and records showed that there were over 30 calls between Robert and Duffy. When both of the stuntmen had refused to kill her, they claimed that Robert had taken matters into his own hands. Bonnie had always had a strange habit of recording every one of her phone calls, and the prosecution produced evidence of Bonnie and Robert arguing. They also questioned why Robert had parked on a dark street away from the restaurant on the night of the murder, if the pair feared that she was being followed. They stated that Robert was obsessed with his daughter and wanted his wife out of the picture. The prosecution also claimed that no one had seen Robert return to the restaurant that evening. The defence presented an entirely different version of events. They argued that the lack of gunshot residue proved that Robert had not pulled the trigger. The defence stated that Robert had indeed contacted Duffy, but this was because he wanted protection and for Duffy to deal with the person who was lurking outside of their house. This was backed up by the other stuntman's son, who testified that his father had been offered $10,000 to rough up the stalker. They further agreed that the booth where Robert and Bonnie had sat that evening was near the entrance to the restaurant, and Robert could easily have returned unseen if the hostess had been away from the front desk at the time. The defence continued by discrediting the 2 stuntmen by catching them in lies regarding their own drug use. On the 16th of March 2005, Robert was found not guilty of Bonnie's murder. The district attorney publicly labelled the jury incredibly stupid, with many people believing that Robert had got away with murder. However, many who were close to the case held the opposite view, as there simply wasn't anything of any substance which linked Robert to the crime. Just a few months later, Robert was again in court to face the civil suit filed by Bonnie's family. Whilst a criminal case has to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, the threshold in a civil case is considerably lower in that a preponderance of evidence must support the plaintiff's claim. That is, that the plaintiff's argument is more likely to be true than false. Robert did not testify at his criminal trial, but had to at the civil suit. During his testimony, he was argumentative, angry, and defensive. At times, he would raise his own objections and even went so far as to sustain one of them. The jury deliberated for 8 days before returning the verdict that he was liable for Bonnie's death and awarding damages of $30 million. A subsequent appeal upheld this decision but reduced the damages to $15 million. Despite this ruling, the jury at the civil trial could not agree on the way in which Robert was responsible for his wife's death. Had he pulled the trigger, or had he paid someone to do it for him? The civil case was not without further controversy, as it was reported that some jurors had decided upon his guilt before the trial had even begun. Shortly after the ruling, Robert filed for bankruptcy and hasn't worked as an actor for over 2 decades. Further information from Robert's criminal defence team revealed that during their trial preparation, they had heard from a lady by the name of Diane Madsen. She advised that she had overheard Christian Brando talking to someone by the name of Duffy on the telephone. Christian had previously claimed that he did not know Duffy. Another witness, Brian Allen, came forward stating that he had seen Duffy talking to a man he knew called Mark Jones. Mark was known to have a drug abuse problem, and shortly before Bonnie's murder had been seen by Brian carrying a gun which matched the murder weapon. Other people had also witnessed Mark with this gun. The defence had brought a motion to include this information at trial, but the motion had been denied. The defence believed that Mark Jones shot Bonnie after being hired by Duffy either at the request of or in order to impress Christian Brando. 4 weeks after Bonnie's murder, Mark Jones took his own life. Christian Brando died in 2009 from pneumonia, and Duffy died from natural causes a few years later. Opinion remains divided as to whether or not Robert is guilty of murder. Bonnie's family remain convinced that he killed Bonnie, but Robert maintains his innocence to this day. The murder officially remains unsolved, and with many of the key people involved in these events now dead, it is extremely unlikely that we will ever fully know the truth. Thanks very much for listening to that story. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, please click the subscribe button. Please leave any comments down below. As always, I'll be interested in reading them. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. On Bonnie's IMDb page, she appeared as an extra on Radio Days and Turk 182. Goodbye. For today's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life of the actress Dominique Ellen Dunne. Dominique was born in Santa Monica, California on the 23rd of November 1959. Her parents, Ellen Beatrice Griffin Dunne and Dominic Dunne, already had 2 sons, Griffin and Alexander. They had also previously lost 2 daughters in infancy. Ellen and Dominic were wealthy and successful. He worked as a producer, actor and writer, and Dominique had a happy childhood. Her parents divorced when she was 10 years old, but remained close, and both were actively involved in their children's upbringings. From a young age, Dominique was interested in acting and began performing when she was in her early teens. Her older brother Griffin already worked as an actor and producer. After graduating from high school, Dominique went to the University of Colorado to study acting. However, after just 1 year, she quit the university, instead deciding to return to California to get started on her career. Within 3 weeks of arriving in Hollywood, she had landed her first job in the 1979 television movie Diary of a Teenage Hitchhiker. Then more roles soon followed, including small parts in the TV series Lou Grant, Fame, Breaking Away and Heart to Heart. Her big break came in 1981 when she was cast as Dana Freeling, the eldest daughter in the film Poltergeist. Her career was on the up and life was looking very good for Dominique. Driving around Los Angeles in a blue convertible Volkswagen Beetle, she soon became well known on the Hollywood social scene. In the autumn of 1981, Dominique visited the exclusive celebrity hotspot, Ma Maison. This restaurant on Melrose Avenue had been opened in 1973 by Patrick Terrell and had been backed by Gene Kelly. With the addition of Wolfgang Puck in 1975, it soon became a magnet for some of the biggest celebrities of the time. It was here she met the 25-year-old chef, John Sweeney. Their relationship was intense from the start, and within a matter of weeks the pair were living together in a one-bedroom house on Rangeley Avenue in West Hollywood. Unfortunately, their relationship deteriorated as quickly as it started. Dominique soon realised that John was extremely possessive, jealous and domineering, and that he wanted to control all aspects of her life. He needed to know who she was with and what she was doing at all times. When Dominique's father visited from New York, he noticed that the balance was off between the couple and even commented to Dominique's mother that John seemed far more in love with Dominique than she was with him. Despite this, they had no reason to suspect that anything sinister was happening. However, John's controlling nature had now turned into physical abuse, and it soon became apparent that he wasn't ashamed of who knew about it. Following an argument in August 1982, Dominique fled to her mother's home. John arrived shortly afterwards and started banging on the windows and yelling for Dominique to come out. Whilst clearly terrified by this, her family still had no idea of the extent of the violence she was suffering. Despite this treatment, Dominique returned to live with John and the abuse continued. Many of Dominique's friends were witness to either John's threats or abuse, and in September 1982, the couple were overheard arguing by their friend Brian Cook. Brian was staying with them at the time. When Brian heard noises coming from the adjoining room, he went to investigate and found John physically abusing Dominique. Dominique told Brian that John was trying to kill her, but John simply denied this and said that they should all just go back to bed. Dominique agreed, but instead of returning to bed, she climbed out through the bathroom window. When John heard the car engine start, he ran outside and jumped onto the bonnet of the car in an attempt to stop it. However, Dominique managed to escape and drove to a family friend's house where that friend took photographs of her injuries. Dominique then went to her mother's house where she called John and told them that their relationship was over. The following day, Dominique was filming a scene for Hill Street Blues during which she played an assault victim. Due to the level of cuts and bruises on her face, she did not require any makeup for the scene. The bruises seen in the episode had been inflicted by John the night before. When John moved out of their house in West Hollywood, Dominique changed the locks and moved back in. On the 30th of October 1982, Dominique was at her home with the actor David Packer. They were rehearsing lines for their parts in the upcoming television show V, The Final Battle. At around 8:30 p.m. that evening, John arrived at her home begging to talk to her. After a great deal of persuasion, she agreed to talk to him in the porch while her co-star David remained in the house. It wasn't long before David could hear arguing from outside, followed by a noise which sounded like someone being hit. Then he heard screams and then a loud thud. David decided to call the police and was inadvertently put through to the wrong police force and was told that the house was outside of their jurisdiction. He then called a friend and warned them that if he died that night, it was John Sweeney who did it. Leaving through the back door, David made his way round to the front of the house, where he saw Dominique lying in the bushes with John leaning over her. John calmly told David to call the police. This time the police arrived, and when they did so, John admitted that he had attempted to kill Dominique. Dominique was rushed to Cedars-Sinai Hospital and placed on life support. After 4 separate scans all showed no brain activity, Dominique's life support was turned off 5 days later on the 4th of November 1982. Her kidneys and heart were donated for transplant. She was just 22 years old. Dominique's funeral took place on the 6th of November 1982 at Good Shepherd Church, Santa Monica Boulevard. John was charged with first-degree murder and also assault with intent to do great bodily harm for the earlier incident. The owner of Ma Maison, Patrick Carole, described John as a very dependable young man and publicly stated that he would assist John with his legal representation. Jury selection for the trial began in July 1983. John claimed that he was not guilty of the earlier assault, stating that he had simply been trying to prevent Dominique from leaving the house that evening. He also claimed that, on the night of the murder, he had been visiting Dominique after they had agreed to reconcile. He claimed that they were making plans to get back together, marry and have children. He then stated that she had told him that she had changed her mind about being with him, and when he heard this, he was filled with rage and had no memory of what happened next. The next thing he does remember was standing over Dominique and attempting to revive her. He then claims that he had attempted to take his own life. However, there was no evidence to support this. The prosecution seemed to have their case hampered at every turn by Judge Burton S. Katz, who often seemed far more concerned with how he was perceived than presiding over a murder trial. When the prosecution brought in one of John's previous girlfriends, Lillian Pierce, she was there to testify about the violence which she had suffered at his hands. She was then not allowed to do so in front of the jury until the judge had reviewed her evidence. After doing so, Judge Katz decided that the prosecution could not use Lillian's testimony, as the prejudicial effect outweighed the probative value. The jury were never made aware of what had happened to Lillian. In addition, the judge refused to let Dominique's friends of her mother testify about the fear and abuse which they had witnessed on the basis that their statements were hearsay. If Lillian Pierce, Dominique's mother, and her friends' testimonies had been allowed, the prosecution would have been able to prove at least 13 cases of significant violence committed by John. Instead, the lack of this information allowed the defence to paint John as an ordinarily reasonable person who had an isolated incident of violence. When 2 photographs that had been taken after the first assault were shown in court, the defence team tried to undermine these by showing the third in the series of photographs. In this third photograph, Dominique was seen laughing, leading the defence to question the photograph's validity. It was explained to the court that this third photograph was taken when an ironic joke was made about Dominique no longer needing makeup for her scene as an abuse victim later that day, and in no way belittled her injuries. The police officer who was first at the scene on the night of the murder told the court that John had confessed at the scene of the crime, and it was further established at Dominique's autopsy that she was brain dead before being taken to hospital. It was established that death by strangulation would have taken between 4 and 6 minutes, which the prosecution argued was plenty of time for John to realise what he was doing. During the trial, the judge seemed to treat John with empathy, but Dominique's family with disdain. After a motion was put forward by John's legal team, the judge ruled that the charge of first-degree murder had to be removed, as in his opinion there was insufficient evidence to support this highest charge due to there being no evidence of either premeditation or deliberation. The only options then open to the jury were second-degree murder or manslaughter. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for 8 days, and on the 23rd of September 1983, they returned their verdict. John was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter and misdemeanor assault. To clarify, the definition of voluntary manslaughter is that of intentionally killing a human being when the offender had no prior intent to kill when they acted in the heat of passion under circumstances that would cause a reasonable person to become emotionally or mentally disturbed. There was public outrage at the verdict, and by the time of the sentencing hearing, the judge had changed his stance and criticised the jury for not returning a guilty of murder verdict. This was despite him being the one who had removed the first-degree murder option. John was given the maximum sentence for his crimes, 6.5 years. He was sent to a medium security prison in Susanville, California, where he served 3 years, 7 months and 27 days in custody. He was paroled in September 1986. Soon after his release, John was hired as head chef at a high-end Los Angeles restaurant called The Chronicle. When Dominique's family found out about this, they protested outside the restaurant, handing out flyers saying, "The food you will eat tonight was made by the hands that killed Dominique Dunne." John lost his job soon after. He then moved to northwestern USA, changing his name to John Maurer. The Dunne family then found out that John had become engaged and contacted his new fiancée's family to warn them of his past. John went on to claim that the Dunne family were harassing him. Reports vary as to his whereabouts today and whether or not he is still alive. Dominique's mother started a support group called Justice for Victims of Homicide, which is still active today. For your information, I will put a link up for the website. Her work was honoured by President George Bush at the White House in 1989. Dominique's father, Dominic, passed away in 2009 from bladder cancer when he was 83. That concludes today's story. This story was suggested to me by Midgie Yoon. There was also a few other comments made by certain people, so I'm just going to mention them. It was Betty James, A.S.M. Wood, Breezy and Sandra Sanders. So thanks for people commenting on that and suggesting this story. As usual, please leave your comments down below. Thanks very much for listening to the Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. Donnie Ettus has asked me to say the word slough. So Donnie, slough. It's spelt S-L-O-U-G-H. Goodbye. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the lives of Carole Tregoff and Bernard Finch, and a story which played out through the tabloid media in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Carole was born in 1937 in South Pasadena, California. She graduated from Mark Keppel High School in Alhambra in 1955. She was a tall, beautiful young woman who completed a brief modelling course after high school but aspired to be an interior decorator. At the age of 18, she married her high school sweetheart, James Papa. James was 3 years older than Carole and was originally from Louisiana. However, his family relocated to California when he was young. James became a bodybuilder who would later go on to become a Mr. USA contestant. After their marriage, the couple bought a home in Big Dalton Avenue in La Puente, California. From the outside, this beautiful young couple seemed to have it all, but as we so often see, appearances can be very deceptive. Later, in 1955, 18-year-old Carole began working at the West Covina Medical Center in Los Angeles. This was owned by a man named Bernard Finch. 38-year-old Bernard was an extremely successful and wealthy married doctor. Both Bernard and his wife of 4 years, 29-year-old Barbara, were keen tennis players and were frequently seen at the local country club or out socialising with their rich and famous friends. This was the second marriage for both Bernard and Barbara, and they both had children from their previous marriages. Bernard had 3 children, Tom, Sharon and Linda, from his marriage to Francis Finch, and Barbara had a daughter named Patty from her marriage to Lyle Doherty. After Bernard and Barbara married in 1951, their ex-spouses started dating and went on to get married. Subsequently, Lyle then adopted Bernard's 3 children. Bernard and Barbara lived in a luxurious house on Lark Hill Drive together with her daughter Patty and their son Raymond, who was born in 1953. At his medical centre, Bernard had a reputation amongst the female staff of being a womaniser who had multiple affairs. In August 1956, after working for Bernard for around a year, Carole was promoted to become his medical secretary, and less than 6 months later, the pair had their first private lunch together. An affair soon followed, and within a couple of months, Bernard had rented an apartment in Monterey Park, which the couple visited every lunchtime in order to continue their affair. This went on for over a year before Barbara discovered her husband's infidelity in 1958. Barbara then called Carole's husband, James, who was shocked to learn that his wife was being unfaithful to him. When James confronted Carole, she told him that she wanted a divorce and moved out of their home and returned to live with her dad and stepmom. Meanwhile, Barbara decided to hire a private investigator to gather evidence of her husband's adultery. Under California law at the time, a divorce would entitle Barbara to half of Bernard's estimated $750,000 fortune. However, if she could prove adultery, the court could apportion any percentage to the aggrieved party that they deemed appropriate. Bernard was facing financial ruin. As the relationship between Bernard and Barbara became increasingly strained, Carole moved to Las Vegas, where she began working as a cocktail waitress whilst living in an apartment paid for by Bernard. On the 16th of May 1959, Barbara reported to the police that Bernard had pistol whipped her. When the police arrived, Bernard had already left the house and there was no further action taken. Bernard moved into a motel near his medical centre. 4 days later, on the 20th of May 1959, Bernard was served with divorce papers, citing his adultery and extreme cruelty as grounds for the divorce. A court order was issued freezing his financial assets. Bernard was livid. Barbara confided in their maid, 19-year-old Marie Ann Lidholm, that Bernard had threatened to kill her by putting her body in a car and pushing it over the cliff near their home, and if he couldn't do that, he would hire someone to kill her. Soon after these threats were made, Barbara set about getting a restraining order and visited a private detective to find out about hiring a bodyguard and also about how she should go about obtaining a concealed handgun license. It is reported that she told this detective that she probably wouldn't be alive by Christmas. On Friday, the 17th of July 1959, Bernard took a late flight from California to Las Vegas to spend the weekend with Carole. The following day, Saturday the 18th of July, Barbara left her house at around 2:30 p.m. to go to the Los Angeles Tennis Club. She arrived back home at around 11 p.m. that evening, parking her car in the garage. Shortly afterwards, Barbara lay dead under a small tree on the edge of her property, having sustained 2 skull fractures and having been shot in the back just below her shoulder blade. The police were notified by Marie and arrived at the scene shortly after. Different stories as to what had happened that night began to emerge. Marie informed the police that she had been inside the house when she heard Barbara's car pull into the garage. A few minutes later, Marie heard arguing and Barbara shouting for help. Marie ran to the garage, switched on the light and saw Barbara lying on the garage floor, bleeding from a cut on her forehead. Bernard was standing over her. Marie then told the police how Bernard had rushed towards her, grabbed her by the face and banged her head into the garage wall. Marie was knocked almost unconscious by the blow, but could vaguely remember hearing Bernard telling her to get in the car. She dragged herself into the rear seat. Marie went on to state that Bernard had a gun in his hand and was forcing Barbara to get into the driver's seat of the car. However, Barbara jumped out of the car and ran out of the garage in the direction of Bernard's parents' house, who lived about 30 metres away. Marie used this opportunity to run back into the house and phone the police. As she was doing so, she heard a gunshot. The following morning, Bernard was arrested at Carole's Las Vegas apartment. After initially refusing to talk, he then insisted that he was in Las Vegas with Carole at the time of Barbara's murder. He stated that his car had been at the airport from the Friday evening as proof of his whereabouts. However, Carole told a different story. She claimed that she had moved to Las Vegas to get away from the love triangle and that Bernard had visited her on the Friday evening and he had suggested that they visit Barbara to sort out their divorce. Carole and Bernard drove from Las Vegas to Covina in her 1957 DeSoto. She then parked along the road from Barbara's house. They walked up to Barbara's house and upon discovering that she was not at home, sat down on the front lawn to await her return. Carole then described how, when Barbara returned home and saw them, she screamed and pulled a gun out of her handbag. When Carole saw the gun, she ran and hid in the bushes and claims to have not seen or heard what had happened after that. When the police arrived, she crept away, returned to her car and drove back to her apartment in Las Vegas. When she arrived, Bernard was already there. Carole told the police that they had visited Barbara because Bernard was demanding a divorce, which Barbara was refusing. However, the court records proved that Barbara had already initiated a divorce, so was Carole lying or had Bernard lied to her? Bernard later admitted to being at Barbara's house on the night of the murder with a version of events that replicated what Carole had said. Bernard claimed that after Barbara had pulled out the gun, Carole had indeed fled. A violent struggle between Barbara and Bernard followed, and when Barbara had started to run away, Bernard said he chased her. He knocked the gun from her hand, but as he picked it up to throw it away, he claimed that the gun accidentally fired. Barbara continued to run away, but fell as she did so. Bernard caught up with Barbara and was amazed that she had been shot. He tried to leave her to phone for help, but Barbara asked him to stay with her. Her final words, according to Bernard, was to ask him to look after the children, both of whom were in the house at the time of the shooting, but thankfully did not wake up. Bernard went on to claim that in his distress he stole 2 cars, a Ford from nearby Citrus Avenue, which he then abandoned in La Puente before stealing a red and white Cadillac. He then drove back to Las Vegas to be with Carole. The Cadillac was found near Carole's apartment when Bernard was arrested the following morning. Carole testified at Bernard's preliminary hearing on the 29th of July. As soon as she left the witness stand, she was arrested. The police had suspected her involvement in the crime all along, and discrepancies in her testimony confirmed this to them. Bernard and Carole stood trial together, starting in December 1959. The trial attracted excessive media attention, with details about the successful doctor and his beautiful mistress dominating news headlines. The press coverage was so intense that even when there was no new information to report, they ran stories about what Carole and Bernard would be eating for their Christmas dinner and how they would each be celebrating Christmas whilst in jail. The prosecution, who firmly believed Marie's version of events, also brought into evidence letters that Marie had sent home to her mother before the murder, telling her of the violence and threats that Barbara had suffered at Bernard's hands. Additionally, the prosecution presented a witness by the name of John Patrick Cody, who testified that Bernard and Carole had hired him to seduce Barbara so that Bernard could counterclaim for adultery in the divorce. This was his plan to avoid financial ruin. This plan did not work, so Bernard and Carole paid John to kill Barbara. They made a down payment of $350, and several days later, John told Carole that the job was done, so she paid him the remainder of his fee, $850. In reality, John had spent the weekend partying, and Barbara was still alive. When Bernard and Carole found out, John expressed surprise and stated that he must have killed the wrong woman. The couple agreed to pay a further $200 for John to complete the job, at which point he took the money and disappeared. John also testified that Bernard had said to him, "Before you kill her, tell her the bullet came from Bernie." The prosecution also presented evidence of what would become known in the press as a do-it-yourself murder kit. Bernard's brown leather briefcase was found at the scene of the crime and contained, amongst other things, bullets, a carving knife, 2 10-foot pieces of clothesline, sleeping pills, a stomach pump, a small bottle of unidentified liquid, hypodermic needles, surgical gloves, and train schedules. The prosecution put forward the proposal that the couple had planned to ambush Barbara when she arrived home, knock her out with sedatives, then inject a fatal air bubble into her bloodstream before putting her behind the wheel of her car and pushing it over the cliff in order to make it look like her death was an accident. Bernard took the witness stand on the 3rd of February 1960. He stuck to the version of events which he had earlier described to the police. His defence team tried to show him as a frustrated but loving husband who had been driven into the arms of another woman after his wife lost interest in him following the birth of their son. Bernard admitted the details of his affair with Carole, but claimed that his wife was also aware of it. He stated that they had agreed to date other people whilst postponing their divorce due to its financial implications until his deal to build his new hospital had been finalised. Bernard then claimed that Barbara had gone back on the deal after Carole's estranged husband James had told her details of Bernard's new life with Carole. At this point, Bernard admitted that he and Carole had hired John Cody to seduce Barbara, but nothing more. And when they realised that John was ripping them off, they decided to visit Barbara to try to discuss things calmly with her. Bernard claimed that the so-called murder kit was simply rope for his boat, a knife for the apartment, and various items which he needed in his work as a doctor. After 4 months, the trial came to an end on the 13th of March 1960. The 6 men and 6 women of the jury spent over 40 hours deliberating. This was over a period of 8 days, but they could not reach an agreement. They voted 10-2 that Bernard was guilty of second-degree murder and 8-4 that Carole was innocent. With no consensus reached, a retrial was necessary. Carole was released on $25,000 bail awaiting the second trial, whilst Bernard was denied bail. The new trial started a few months later on the 27th of June and ran until the 7th of November 1960. At the time, this made it the longest trial in California criminal history. All of the jury believed that Bernard was guilty of murder, but they as to whether this was first degree or second degree murder. The jury was also split 9-3 in favour of Carole being guilty. Once again, the trial ended in a hung jury and another trial was scheduled. The following year, starting on January 3rd, 1961, the third trial lasted until Monday the 27th of March, when the jury returned their verdicts. They found Bernard guilty of first-degree murder, Carole guilty of second-degree murder, and them both guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. The Deputy District Attorney stated that they would be seeking the death penalty for both defendants. On the 5th of April 1961, both Bernard and Carole were sentenced to life in prison. After hearing the verdict, Carole cried, "No, no, no, I'll be an old woman when I get out." With this sentence, they would both become eligible for parole after serving 7 years, which is in stark contrast to the first ballot of the jury, which resulted in 11-1 in favour of the death penalty. Carole went to prison still declaring her love and dedication to Bernard and stating that they would marry once their sentences were complete. 7 years later, in 1968, both Carole, who was described as a model prisoner, and Bernard were denied parole. The following year, on the 1st of May 1969, Carole was granted parole and released from prison. She went into hiding at a friend's home and took a new name. Bernard was again denied parole, but this was granted 2 years later in 1971. He was released from prison on the 29th of October 1971, having served just over 10 years of his sentence. Carole remained living in the West Covina area, where she worked at a hospital until she retired. Bernard went on to marry a psychiatric social worker and practiced medicine in Missouri for several years before getting his California medical license reinstated. He died in 1995 at the age of 77. Despite declarations of their undying love, Bernard and Carole never met again after their release from prison. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. There's a book called A Murder in West Covina that covers the case. It's written by James L. Jones. Goodbye.